Among other things, anthropology provided psychology with the racial system needed to justify intellectually the existence of differences among human beings. Carl von Linnaeus made racial distinctions based on color of skin, temperament, customs, and habits. With this, he made numbers of racial classifications, which placed the black man at the bottom of the human family hierarchy. Under the entry Negro, this official government document described the black man as belonging to the lowest division of mankind from an evolutionary standpoint. The term Negro was thus considered a racial designation without regard to place of origin, from consideration any ethnic characteristics within the race. From this framework, the role of inferiority was clearly assigned to all black people of the world. The biblical explanation for racial groupings had presented a major problem for congruence. As the white man explored and plundered new worlds, he claimed that the discovered savages were not descendants of Adam, and therefore were outside the grace of God.
A variety of brass instruments were used to measure human responses to different sensory stimuli. The Galton whistle created different sounds due to the squeezing of a rubber bulb that was closed off by a piston. When the piston was adjusted, the tone of the sound varied. Another instrument are tuning forks. These are meant to sound in unison when the weights were adjusted correctly. These two instruments were used for auditory measurement. Another brass instrument used was called the olfactometer. This was used to see how far the subject was able to detect an odor from an unopened bottle. There is a valve located on one end of the tubing, releasing different amounts of the odor. An esthesiometer was used to measure skin tactile sensitivity and the awareness of temperature differences. Through the metal tip, hot and cold water would be released with the tip slightly pressed against the skin of the subject. Another instrument was called a taste sensiter. This was a glass applicator. The openings would be placed on the subject's tongue. The inlet would then allow various solutions through the tubes. The last instrument used was called the reaction key. This measured responses to various sound or light stimuli.
Methods for judging variations among Homo sapiens were developed to support the different racial classifications. One was developed by John Friedrich Blumenbach in 1824. It was designed to visually judge variation among craniums, and it was called Norma Verticalis. It was performed by placing a skull between the feet of the observer and would be examined from above. It would then be classified into different races such as Caucasian and Mongol based on its shape. Blumenbach's procedures were also used as a technique for distinguishing those skulls whose previous owners were designated as, quote, civilized, or from those designated as, quote, uncivilized. Theoreticians F.J. Gall and G. Spurzheim wrote a 6-volume anatomy and physiology of the nervous system. In it, they accurately speculated that different kinds of behavior were controlled by separate parts of the brain. However, they mistakenly declared that the external shape of the skull reflected the shape of the brain underneath. This led to the false knowledge that skull capacities of whites were greater than those of blacks, since whites were generally judged to be more intelligent. Another method was developed by Isidore St. Hilaire in 1847 concerning the shape of the face. He divided human facial structures into orthognathic, which was the white race with an upright jaw, eurygnathic, which was Asians with high cheekbones, and also prognathous, which was the black race with a forward projecting jaw. This information was used to compare Africans to apes, making them look inferior to whites.
So we can learn a lot by examining the mistakes of these older psychologists and apply that to modern psychology. First of all, we need to carefully guard the scientific method. That means thinking through our conclusions to the fullest extent. We need to ask ourselves, does A necessarily imply B? And if not, we need to adjust our methods to be less subjective and more objective. We also need to be careful not to be too quick to accept conclusions, just because they seem like they're reasonable or logical. That's where bias can come in, and that's another thing we need to guard against. Researcher bias was really present in a lot of these studies that were shown in this chapter. For example, on page 48, it talks about how if you bring groups of people together under the same methods and in the same location, that you can get a good basis for comparative study. But that's not at all considering the fact that the people who have been exported out of their homeland into a place where they're discriminated against, they're at a disadvantage. They're going to feel less comfortable during the study. Maybe they're not as confident in the language as the people who have lived there all their life. Or perhaps they're not as comfortable in the areas of language that are surrounded with high society, which they haven't been allowed to get into. So of course, if you have these intelligence tests and those kinds of things that are created by people who interpret intelligence to be a certain way, everyone who's not like them is at a disadvantage in those tests. So that's a huge area of research bias. That's something we have to be really careful about. And finally, we have to be really careful about statistically significant numbers as well. For example, on page 47, you can see the number of cases for whites, Indians, Negroes. They're all less than 20. They're 11 and 12, and that's not nearly enough to make conclusions. It's not statistically significant. So we need to be careful of all these things and carefully guard the scientific method and guard against our own biases, whether through double-blind experiments or however we're going to modify our methods. We need to do that when we're studying things to avoid these wrong conclusions in the future.